Welcome everybody on this great Friday afternoon, and I appreciate people joining us for one of our regular monthly by name list and coordinated access community of practice calls. We're excited to have some great information today. We'll introduce the presenter here in a minute, but I hope that everyone's doing well and your weather is cooperating. We were just talking ahead of time that where I am here in Alberta, I plan to go from about 25 below today to 4 degrees above on Sunday. And so we'll see if I can adjust to that climate change, but I think we'll manage. As long as it's going to get warmer, I'll manage. But anyways, we're happy to have everybody here, and we look forward to having a great discussion today. Again, people will be muted automatically as they've come in. And then when we get to the question and answer portion of things, we'll ask you to unmute yourself, or we'll unmute you, and then you can mute and unmute yourself at that point in time. I'm just hoping that my slides are going to move here. There we go. So my name is Wally Czech. I am the Director of Training and Technical Assistance with the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. I also wanted to mention that we have Ashley Vandermark with us from the Canadian Alliance. She's from the Built for Zero Canada program within the Canadian Alliance. And she has also joined us, and she is one of the improvement advisors for that program. And she works directly with Michael and his gang out there in New Brunswick. So we have her on board to provide moral support and other kinds of support that Michael might need to go through this community of practice call. Just a little bit about the Canadian Alliance. For those of you who may not be aware, we have become a very multifaceted organization in a fairly quick period of time. I mentioned there's the Training and Technical Assistance and Built for Zero Canada. Many of you, I'm sure, have been to the national conference, which happens every October, November of each year. And we also have another facet to what we do called Allied Networks, and there's multiple things that are being supported in there, and this is related to various partnerships that we have with different groups throughout Canada that are performing different functions in the world of ending homelessness. Some examples of some of those would be the Shelter Network organization. We have some lived experience groups. We have the Rural and Remote Alliance to End Homelessness, and various other organizations. There's some veterans work that's happening. There's lots of different things that are within that are being supported. And so we're very proud and excited to be able to have all of those features within our organization. Just as a reminder, our mission is very simple, but yet we believe very powerful, and that we are hoping to lead a national movement of individuals and organizations and communities working together to end homelessness in Canada. And that's another reason why these community of practice calls are so helpful, because it works to bring different communities together as well to talk about key issues and common challenges. So we're excited for that. We wanted to also mention that what we are doing today, this community of practice call, is funded in part by the Government of Canada through the Community Capacity and Innovation funding stream of Reaching Home, which is Canada's homelessness strategy. And we're grateful to them for their support in both dollars and other areas to help us make this work as effective as it is. So just a brief note about community of practice calls. They are slightly different than what you would think of as a normal webinar. We have some information that's being provided as a very brief presentation that gives some key information and insights and ideas. And then after that, we hope to spend time having some discussion and question and answer. The whole thing will last a maximum of 1 hour. But it is, again, much more of a brief presentation and discussion as opposed to a webinar where the presentation takes up pretty much the entire time. We will, as with all of our webinars and community of practice calls, have the slides from the presentation available, plus the recording of this webinar available in our archive on the TTA website. And to get to that, that is training dot, what is my website? training.caeh.ca under the menu item of webinars. So you'll be able to get all of that there, and you can download the slides if you need to. So again, for the Q&A portion, please make sure that you're on mute unless you would like to speak. As I said, at this moment, everyone is muted, but we will unmute, and that will unmute everyone. So what we would ask is that as you see the microphone icon, if you would click on that to mute yourself unless you're going to talk, that will help us keep out background noise, both for the discussion and for the recording. And our agenda for today is very simple. The introductions, which we've done. In a moment, I'm going to turn it over to our presenter, and then we'll have the Q&A and discussion. And then once that's done, I'll have a couple of other slides that I'll show you, and we'll close off, and that'll be it. So to not delay things any further, I am going to stop sharing my slides, and I am going to introduce you to Michael McKenzie. Michael McKenzie is coming to us from St. John's, New Brunswick, and he's been doing some fantastic work out there, as I mentioned before, with the help of Ashley, the Heal for Zero program, and their community. They've been working really hard and have made some great strides in their efforts to work through their coordinated access and by name list process. So I will let you speak more about yourself, Michael, and I'll turn it over to you.
Cool. Thanks, Wally. And thank you, Ashley, for your moral support. It's very appreciated. And thanks, everyone, for joining. I'm really pleased to be here to talk a little bit about our experience in St. John with regard to setting up our BNL and creating a coordinated access system. And for us, it really has been a situation of starting small and scaling up. That's not necessarily how we planned it from the get-go. We ended up taking this phased approach really almost by accident. But it's definitely been a happy accident, and one that I would say, have really benefited from, and that I think other communities could also benefit from. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about how coordinated access has evolved and continues to evolve for us. It started as a small pilot project and has really grown into a more formalized, robust system, which has actually drawn the attention of local news media and subsequently systems like health and corrections, to the point where we're now being approached by these systems to ask about becoming more integrated, which has been a really interesting and encouraging experience for us. So just to take it back a little bit, I guess, I'll explain who I am and what my organization is. So my name is Michael McKenzie. I'm a system planner with the Human Development Council. We're a social planning council here in St. John, and we are also the community entity for St. John, Fredericton, and Moncton. So we're responsible for ensuring outcomes around coordinated access under Reaching Home in those three communities. We've also been driving HIPAA 4 implementation for the past few years, which is another topic on which I could speak to the benefit of starting small and scaling up. Essentially, my main responsibilities over the past 4 years have been concerning coordination and data. And so I've been very lucky to be close to the work of implementing coordinated access and work with a pretty fantastic team here in St. John, certainly supported by Ashley. So that's a little bit about who I am and who I work for. I also wanted to just provide a bit of context around St. John in case people aren't intimately familiar with our city. We are sometimes confused with St. John's, Newfoundland, which is a different place, a beautiful place, but it's not this place. So St. John has a population of close to 68,000 people, closer to 124,000 in the greater St. John area. We have about 1,800 people who are on the waiting list for affordable housing in our region. And in terms of homelessness, we currently have 111 people who are actively experiencing homelessness. Of those, 54 are chronically homeless, and that's from our BNL. So I won't spend too much time on this slide, but I did want to provide a bit of a timeline for how long we've been talking about coordinated access in St. John. I mentioned at the outset that we are taking a phased approach to coordinated access. And essentially our implementation is divided into 3 phases, and I will briefly go through each of those phases on the next slide. I also mentioned at the outset that it was a bit of an accident that we went about our implementation in this way. And what I mean by that is that our intention wasn't initially to start small. So when we began talking about coordinated access, and this is back in 2014 with the adoption of SPDAT, we weren't talking about a phased approach at that point. We were really talking about quite a big scope. And I think part of the reason that it took us a few years to really get started was that when you're talking about implementing coordinated access on a grand scale, it's an enormous shift, really. And so I think for us, in thinking about process and procedures and forms and securing buy-in on that type of scale, we ended up getting stuck just trying to wrap our heads around what that actually looked like. And it became very difficult for us to just get started. That changed for us in November of 2018 when we implemented our Out of the Cold housing blitz. And some of you may have heard about that through the CAEH. Basically, we were seeing an increase in rough sleeping and shelter use throughout New Brunswick. In Fredericton and Moncton, they had asked the provincial government for funding to open Out of the Cold shelters. In St. John, rather than opening an Out of the Cold shelter, we decided to request rent supplements from the province, as well as funding to support 2 staff positions for moving people into units, and put our focus entirely on housing. We ended up securing those resources, and so then we had to determine how best to use those rent supplements, how to prioritize people for those rent subs. So pretty quickly we identified that this was a great opportunity for us to pilot a BNL, which up to that point we hadn't done. So that's what we ended up doing. The housing blitz ended up becoming our BNL pilot project. So that lasted from December 2018 until May 2019. We had 3 agencies who were adding names to the BNL, or 2 emergency shelters, as well as an outreach program. We actually had no existing programs who were offering housing support to those people on the BNL, but what we did have was those 2 housing support positions that was funded as part of the housing blitz. Prioritization for this phase was based on shelter occupancy, so we were mainly concerned with alleviating pressure on the existing shelters, as well as VI SPDAT scores. The pilot was really targeting low to moderate acuity clients who needed low to moderate levels of support, and that was one area in moving from our pilot phase to our permanent BNL. That was, the prioritization was something that changed very significantly. So phase 2 was really about applying the learnings from the pilot project, broadening the scope of our coordinated access system, and putting our focus on achieving a quality BNL. So in terms of expanding the scope, we went from having 3 agencies in the pilot to more than 10 who are now referring or adding individuals to the BNL. We also have 6 programs who now offer housing supports. We also finalized and formalized our prioritization in June of 2019. and introduced case conferencing in October of 2019. Phase 3, our focus is on achieving advanced quality for our coordinated access system. So more focus for us on engaging systems, which we began doing in November of 2019. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, that engagement has, interestingly, largely been initiated by folks within systems, which has been great, although entirely unexpected. Once we conclude phase 2 and have that quality BNL, our focus will shift to reducing our chronic numbers to the point of hitting functional zero, which we anticipate happening. Our target for that is March of 2022. So that's obviously a very high level overview, but essentially this is what our phased approach looks like. And I would say that this approach has actually had a lot of benefits for us. So I'll just go through a few of those. The first is really the ability to try out different processes and see how they work. So not that you can't do this on a larger scale, but I would say it's certainly easier with fewer players involved. If something doesn't work, the ramifications are certainly much smaller, and we found it much easier to pivot and try something else. Building a circle of champions has been really nice for us. So for a long time, I would say there was 2 or 3 of us within the community who every once in a while would talk about coordinated access, about establishing or developing a BNL, but without actually having an example to point to, without having a system in place, it became very difficult to try to get buy-in from the homelessness response system. And so at a certain point, it really just became kind of a thought experiment for those of us who were talking about it. By starting small with just the 2 shelters in the outreach program, we were able to secure their buy-in and build this circle of champions. And so it wasn't all on the coordinators to preach the benefits of coordinated access. We had these partners, this group of agencies who had actually seen the process work and could speak to its success. And so that's been really helpful in terms of securing buy-in from other agencies as well. Demonstrating effectiveness. So again, we preached the effectiveness of coordinated access until we were blue in the face. And it didn't matter until we actually had a system that we could point to and to, until we were able to demonstrate the effectiveness of that system. In our case, showing the work that we were doing, demonstrating the effectiveness in terms of prioritization, streamlining access to those housing supports. That all resulted in us acquiring more resources that then in turn allowed us to do the work better and to scale up more effectively. So an example of that is in our report back to the province after concluding our housing blitz, or the phase 1 pilot project, social development decided to allocate an additional 35 rent supplements to the BNL. And so that was back in May of 2019. And then again, just before Christmas, about a month ago, we got word that they were dedicating another 23 rent supplements to the BNL. So social development has really bought into this process. They're now directing all requests for rent supplements or public housing for homeless individuals to the BNL. So they're certainly bought in, and that was based on what we demonstrated through the pilot project. On top of that, beyond that, we were able to secure a partnership with our energy utility to cancel utility deposits and connection fees for anyone that's housed through this process as well, which is huge. I mean, that amounts to over $300 for some individuals and getting set up in a unit. So that was identified as a huge barrier. We were able to secure that partnership by showing them what we had actually done through our pilot project. And there's a number of other partnerships as well. We had one with a furniture store who supplied furniture for our first 15 units and is still very engaged. And this all of these resources were required because we were able to show the effectiveness of this system. So anticipating required resources, starting small was also really helpful for us in evaluating what kind of resources we would require for a more comprehensive coordinated access system. So this could be resources like rent supplements that I just mentioned, but also human resources. So what kind of positions do we need? How many positions? And those can be difficult questions to answer when you're not in the work. It's hard to know exactly what the work looks like. So starting small gave us the opportunity to better understand the work, essentially by doing the work off the side of our desk, but at a manageable scope or scale, and to be able to then project what that work looks like on a larger scale. So what the work of the BNL coordinator looks like, for example, or whether or not there are positions aside from a BNL coordinator, perhaps a landlord engagement officer, that we would require when we do actually scale up. In our case, because we are the community entity for St. John, Fredericton, and Moncton, we were also looking at this as a way of understanding what those resources might look like across 3 communities. And so for us, getting that understanding before actually investing resources was extremely helpful. So finally, the ability to be creative, and this is certainly related to the first point, but starting small really does give you the chance to be creative and to try different things out. When you're working with a small team, so the circle of champions that I referenced, when you have established some trust, it's much easier to say, let's try this out, let's give that a shot. If it doesn't work, we'll try something else. And because you're doing it on a small scale, again, the risk is much lower than when you actually scale up. So there's a lot more freedom to be creative. So what scaling up looked like for us, I think I've covered a lot of this already, but I will summarize these points. So expanding the scope, onboarding new agencies, this is a fairly obvious one. In our case, as I mentioned, we went from having 3 agencies involved in the pilot project to more than 10 in phase 2. We're closer to 15 now. And so that's obviously a big shift. That was a big change for us. Formalizing process and policy. So during our pilot project, we felt quite free to try things out, to test things, adjust our process. And it was really an opportunity for us to figure things out in what was a fairly low risk environment. Scaling up meant that we really wanted to decide what worked and to commit to adopting that in a formal way. And that certainly doesn't mean that we stop evaluating or that we don't make adjustments anymore. But what it means is that we have a firm process, we have documented policies, and if major changes are to be made, it's after a fairly rigorous evaluation. And it's after discussion at a governance level. So it's a much more formalized approach. So replicating success in other communities, for us, scaling up hasn't just meant broadening the scope in St. John. It's also meant being able to share and replicate some of the success that we've had in other communities in New Brunswick as well. So during phase 2, as we finalized prioritization, refined our BNL, began case conferencing, all these types of things, and began to see the impact that those changes were having, we were able to then share that with Fredericton and Moncton and actually implement some of those same tools. And people have been quite enthusiastic about that. So planning for growth, I think I pretty much covered this in the benefits section. So I think that is what it has looked like. It gave us an opportunity to decide what types of positions were needed, what kinds of resources, and those types of things. So I'll end with this. probably our biggest takeaway on the theme of starting small and scaling up is really that scaling up is not just copying and pasting. So I've mentioned a couple of times that from phase 1 to 2, we went from 3 agencies to more than 10, and that we're now closer to 15. That doesn't mean that we established a process or policies in phase 1 that has just continued on through the expansion of the system. For us, it's really meant building the structure or the foundation of our coordinated access system, developing policies that make sense for the partners around the table, but understanding that with each new partner, the context changes slightly. So whether it's introducing a new target population, bringing on a youth serving agency that wasn't at the table before, that's now introducing youth to the BNL, whether it's a new housing program that has a specific population that they support, whether it be onboarding agencies that are now referring to access points, whereas during the pilot project, all participating agencies were also access points. These are all significant changes that come with expanding the scope of the system. And some of these things you can anticipate and plan for, but a lot of them you just can't. So for us, it's really been about engaging partners in a meaningful way and understanding what their participation in the system looks like and how that might impact our current process and policies. So essentially, I summarize that here by saying, starting small allows you to build the structure for coordinated access, and scaling up requires you to, do some renovations to that structure, but maintaining the foundation. And I would say that's really where we've seen the greatest benefit here in St. John to this kind of phased approach that we've taken, is really building that solid foundation that's now supporting our coordinated access system as it continues to grow, which it does continue to do. So that's all I have there. Did you want me to leave my slides up, Wally?
Yeah, for now, if you would, and because you might want to maybe refer to them as we have some conversation and discussion. I actually wanted to pull Ashley in for a minute and just say, Ashley, based on what you heard Michael talk about and so forth, what were some of the thoughts that came to your mind as he was sharing that information? And yeah, just so you know, you're muted as well.
Thanks, Wally. I would have started talking. Yeah, thanks so much, Michael. I'm so happy you touched on the points that you did. And I think it really, you gave a great picture of the process that you've gone through in St. John. I really appreciate it. I actually screenshotted it. I loved that last slide that you did. If maybe you can just flip back. Where you talked about starting small allows you to build this structure, but scaling up doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to apply the exact same process. And that iteration is going to be exactly the same in this very, very straight line. Iteration often involves some adjustments and some pivoting. And so I really, really appreciated you leaning in on that and highlighting that and how that's such a super important piece of scaling up. And not to be deceived that it'll necessarily be linear. The other thing, and I know there are some questions, so I do want to make sure that folks get a chance to have their questions answered. But I know we've definitely talked about this as we've been connecting, and I'm sure it would be beneficial for folks to hear more about your circle of champions and how those strategies that you've used in order to engage those circle of champions on the small level, and how that has looked as you've iterated and you've scaled up in that circle, and how you've managed to maintain that buy-in as iteration happens and scaling up happens and processes may need to shift then. because change can be hard, especially when we're in this long-term game of ending chronic homelessness. So again, don't want to jump the queue of questions, but I think that'd be a great area if you could just dive in a bit further.
Yeah, so,
Respond, Michael.
oh, sorry, Wally.
No, go ahead and respond.
Okay. The process of securing buy-in is a really interesting one. And I was lucky enough to present on that in Edmonton. I mean, I think that we've actually been quite lucky in St. John. I know there are, you know, agencies doing great work all across the country. I don't know if we're just kind of particularly amenable people, but I would say there are not a lot of personalities throwing up roadblocks in St. John. Having said that, shifting to coordinated access brings a huge number of challenges just in terms of changing the way that agencies have operated for decades in some cases. So for us, when we initially tried to secure buy-in for coordinated access, when we tried in a very concerted way, it was through something we called a barrier busting bash. And it was essentially an experiential learning exercise to walk people through what it looked like for someone who is experiencing homelessness to try to obtain housing and all the barriers that they can encounter. This wasn't just for nonprofits or agencies within the homelessness response system. It was also for government, agencies like Service New Brunswick or our utility, our energy utility, who didn't necessarily understand the role that they played in setting up barriers for people experiencing homelessness. So that experience was really hugely successful for us in terms of securing buy-in. But as I mentioned in the presentation, it's really hard to maintain that buy-in when you don't see the system itself. I think even talking about a by-name list, people often, without seeing a list in front of them, it's really hard to understand what that means. So developing that circle of champions for us was all about getting buy-in from people on the front line and not just having those of us who are coordinators telling them that this is a best practice that they should be adopting. And so it hasn't been easy. It's not, you know, we certainly got buy-in in the pilot project, but as I mentioned, as you reiterated, that process doesn't stay exactly the same as you do scale up. So for us, it's all about continually engaging those partners, both at the governance level. So we have the governance table where decisions are made, and we can have open and frank conversations there, but also engaging outside of that with agencies to ensure that they still believe in the ideal of coordinated access. And so it's constant work to ensure that we still have that buy-in.
That's great. Thanks for that response. And yeah, I agree. Actually, that was a very interesting, I guess, way to look at or formulate the difference between the two. We do have a question that's sort of related to that in terms of getting buy-in and formalization, and it's more specific though to MOUs. But this is from Ralph West. I'm going to actually give Ralph the mic. So Ralph, you'll need to now unmute yourself so that you can talk. So go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, first of all, can you hear me?
You bet.
Yep.
Okay. So I've got maybe two questions. What sort of agreements do you have with the agencies involved? Like, first of all, is it a single agreement that everybody signs, or is it somehow specific to each party? Or do you have some other means by which people come to a mutual understanding of what their responsibilities are? So that's kind of the first part of the question. And the second part is the same question in a different form, which is, do your participating agencies lose all capacity to prioritize clients on their, like, as they see fit? Like, are they all in in that respect? Or is there, do they have some, the reason I'm asking is because we're at the beginning stages of this, and I'm foreseeing difficulty convincing agencies to give up their willingness to, or give up the right to kind of determine which of their own clients are the most important and so on. So, okay. Long and involved, sorry.
And could I just ask quickly, Ralph, where are you from?
St. Thomas, Ontario.
Oh, okay. Okay, great. Well, thanks for the question. Michael, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, good questions. So in terms of agreements, we have an MOU that has been drafted that no one has signed. Now, so essentially our agreement at this point is verbal only. And we do have, I mean, all of the housing programs that participate in our system do dedicate almost all of their resources to the BNL. And so initially, when we developed the MOU, it was quite early on in the process, and that simple step of signing that piece of paper seemed like a big barrier for people. And so it was something that we tried to push a little bit further down the line. We will be doing that in the near future, but yeah, at this point, the agreement is entirely verbal. The accountability that we built in is that everyone is around the same table when we're prioritizing moves for the BNL. And so if people, we always ask the question, who has room on their caseload? What housing programs can support these moves? And so if it happens that a program is not supporting moves off the BNL, then that would certainly come out in front of the entire community, if that's a way of holding people accountable. In terms of the flexibility that's allowed for agencies in who they are going to support, the process by which we prioritize people, we don't identify, the number one priority and say this is who you'll be housing. What we do is we filter our BNL based on the eligibility of the unit that we're looking at if we're talking about housing. So what level of acuity is most appropriate for this unit? Even something like, can you have a dog? Can you smoke? All those types of criteria. That's all built into our BNL. And so we're able to filter the list to show who are the top 5 priorities in terms of vulnerability that we have built into it. And those 5 names are given to the housing program. And then it's up to them to decide which of those clients they're going to support. So certainly it's removed a bit of the choice for agencies, but there's still enough flexibility built in there that, they do have 5 names to choose from. We're not just giving them the one and saying, you signed an MOU and here you go, best of luck kind of thing.
Does that speak to your question, Ralph?
Yes, but I was thinking of it almost more from the other end. Like you said that you're an amenable group of people. Well, that's good. But so if I'm an agency with a focus on, obviously a dedicated focus on our clients, but also a focus on a particular form of disabling condition or whatever that I consider to be more significant than this other agency's, so how do agencies come to kind of give up or mitigate their dedication to like prioritizing their own clients over the clients of others?
Yeah, so at this point, now this might shift slightly when we move out of the transition year and into April 1 under Reaching Home. We have not asked any agencies to change the way that they operate in terms of who they serve. So, an example is we have a youth agency who is at the BNL table and who supports youth who are moving into housing, we wouldn't be asking them to also support adults. So if they only serve clients up to 24, when we filter the list to see who they will be supporting for their move, we would only filter it for youth who are 24 or younger. And more specifically, I mean, if you gave the example of, you know, a disabling condition, we do have the New Brunswick Association of Community Living at the table as well, and so they have a focus on individuals with a physical or mental impairment. And so we would also prioritize those people for supports from NBACL. We wouldn't ask them to change the eligibility criteria for their program.
You know, I just had kind of a thought in that it'd be interesting to know what an agency would then think if all of a sudden all of these clients, as you say, or participants actually became theirs. And, you know, and so then now all of the homeless individuals in the whole community are now your agency's clients. If that would make a difference in what you thought about, you know, who is the priority or not, because I think one of the important components of coordinating your community in this way is also helping your community to understand that these are not just a particular agency's clients, that these people are your community's clients, or the community's citizens and people that need, you know, help and assistance, and that it's more about what's best for those individual participants than what's best for an agency.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, Wally. And I think a benefit to it as well is that in recognizing individuals as our clients and not my client or your client, we have often now, when we're supporting an individual, agencies will partner up. So I mean, agencies do develop some kind of specialty depending on the subpopulation that they work with. But we, you know, so if we have a Housing First program, for example, their specialty would certainly be supporting individuals with high acuity moving into housing. We would often pair them up with NBACL or a program like PCAP, the Parent-Child Assistance Program, if there are children involved. So it gives us the opportunity to say, you know, these clients belong to everyone, and because we're all involved in this same process, let's, you know, double up on the supports, on the wraparound supports that we're offering to these people.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, Ralph, it definitely is you know, can be a challenge in communities to work through that process. But I think it's fantastic that you brought that question up. It gives people some things to think about. You know, we may not have given you as specific or an exact of an answer as you'd like, but some things to chew on anyway. Actually, I'm going to give Marie the microphone because she had a question about your special event that you had. Actually, Ralph, if you could then just mute yourself again, that would be great. Appreciate it. Marie, you'll have to unmute yourself though.
I'm not seeing a mic.
Should be, well, you clicked it to unmute yourself.
Yes, it was easier the first time.
Oh, okay. Should be down in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. There, I muted you, Ralph. So now Marie, you should be able to unmute yourself if you're there. She may not be there. The question that she had asked, I'll read it out loud actually. Who led your barrier busting event and what did that look like? Oh, now she was unmuted there. Anything else you want to say?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Sorry, I'm in transit now, so I'm okay if you ask my question for me. That'd be great.
Okay, yeah, I just did, so we'll see what he has to say.
Yeah, thanks, Marie. So the barrier busting bash was actually, it was something that we had started planning. I can't remember exactly when, but we ended up taking part in a project by the COH called Making Zero Count, which probably a lot of people are familiar with. And so in talking with Katie Burkholder-Harris, who was then with the COH, we had told her about this event that we were planning, and she felt like it would be a good mesh for the work that they were doing in testing the definition of ending homelessness. And so we ended up partnering with the COH on that event, and they've actually developed a resource. We weren't the only community who ended up doing this type of experiential learning piece. So they actually developed a resource, and I know you can access it online through probably the Homelessness Learning Hub, to help other communities who are interested in doing that same kind of exercise. My colleague Chris Gorman and I were just in Charlottetown back in November, also helping along with Katie Burkholder-Harris again, to walk them through the same kind of event when they were talking about implementing coordinated access. So we found it incredibly helpful, particularly for engaging those partners outside of the traditional homelessness response system, to actually give them, show the effectiveness of this approach kind of in your heart instead of in your head. It gives you the feeling of the frustration that people can experience when coming up against all those barriers.
Okay, thanks, Michael. So Ashley, you know, knowing their system as well as you do, were there any other questions that sort of came up for you as Michael was talking?
Oh, that's a good question, Wally. I'm glad you were able to dive further into the Barrier Buster event, Michael. I think that was just such an interesting learning opportunity for you folks in the community, and an interesting way to really test and understand what different engagement strategies could look like. You did talk a little bit about pivoting when you were talking at the beginning of your presentation, and talked about when you're scaling up, it does require you pivoting. And I'm wondering if you can maybe give a couple examples. Sometimes it's hard to kind of wrap our head around what it could look like to pivot in a system when you're trying to go through an implementation process, and being transparent in that and still maintaining buy-in. I think we're used to that step-by-step implementation of a process or a policy. So I'm wondering if you can give an example as you were going through those beginning stages of implementation where you thought, ooh, we really need to pivot. And because you had started small, you had that ability to pivot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one that comes to mind is the way that we would add people or refer people to the BNL initially as part of our pilot project. Because we were dealing with so few agencies, so we really only had 3 agencies that were actually adding names to the list. We had initially done intake forms that were paper forms. So each agency would do an intake and then actually bring them here to the Human Development Council, and we were managing, still do manage the BNL, but we would add names to the list that way. People really liked that approach initially. When we began to broaden the scope, it became not only more for the Human Development Council to manage, having all these different partners coming in with paper forms. We were getting feedback from those agencies that it was taking time out of their day to not only complete the intake, but also have to hand deliver it to someone at our agency. And so after having that conversation, we moved very quickly to doing online intakes only. And so this was a way for agencies to, we send out the link that people can access, do the intake, and it gets submitted automatically. So that was one pivot that we did that people seemed to appreciate. In our minds, we felt like that meant anything we can do online would be better than the old way. And so we started shifting everything online, including updates to the BNL. And that didn't work for everyone. We started getting feedback that, you know, it's kind of cumbersome to have to always access a link from you guys when we want to submit an update for one of our clients. We're not finding it the most efficient way of going about it. And so we had to introduce a couple other ways for people to submit their updates, whether it be creating a specific email address that they can use. We also have the option of then just giving one of us a call and providing an update that way. But I think there are really small things. Those aren't big process pieces, but they're things that make a big difference for the agencies that are involved. It really goes a long way in terms of retaining their buy-in, and has certainly made our process smoother, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, as you're saying that, I'm reflecting and thinking, I mean, when you feel heard and you feel validated in your feedback and you see some action, even if the result is not necessarily what you were looking for, it's that action to know that you're being heard and you're an active part of this process. And so it's definitely, I would say from my lens, done some great things for you as far as buy-in.
Mm-hmm.
So sort of on a similar note, I was wondering about it, like at the very beginning, it became evident fairly quickly how important the development of your champions was. And, you know, and in fact, in the order of things, as you were starting small, it came before providing evidence, demonstrating effectiveness. And I'm just curious to know what you think might have been different in the results of things if you would have sort of, you know, put a bunch of things together and then gone out and done stuff and then tried to come back and show, you know, effectiveness of what you're doing without necessarily having those champions on board yet at that time.
Mm. Yeah, well, I think that without actually implementing the system, that's what we were trying to do for years. And it was really just based on saying, you know, this is a best practice now. Doesn't this sound great? Doesn't this make sense? And certainly, you know, logically, everyone was kind of nodding their heads. Yeah, BNL sounds good. Without, though, having that frontline experience, those agencies actually, you know, agreeing, not just nodding their head, but actually preaching the same words that we were. I think it would have been so much more difficult for us to actually try to get buy-in from the entire, not only the entire homelessness response system, but agencies beyond that. I think having that circle of champions gave a kind of legitimacy to the effort that we just didn't have before that. And so by starting small, we were able to, you know, I would say capitalize on some relationships that we had where there was strong trust. And we were able to leverage that and then demonstrate effectiveness. I think had we tried to start on a large scale in order to demonstrate effectiveness, I don't think it would have worked nearly as well.
Okay. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense to me. We have another question actually that's come in from Cameron Fraser, and Cameron doesn't have a mic, so I'll just read it out. But the question is, what would be included in the intake? Client demographics and VI SPDAT score, question mark, or, you know, what other things are in part of your, included in your intake process?
Yes, all of that. So it's actually quite comprehensive, because what we try to do is gather as much data as we can on the individuals to understand exactly what type of housing is going to be most appropriate for them, as well as what they will be eligible for. Because when we are housing people, it's determined by the eligibility criteria of the units and also the housing program. So certainly all their demographic information, their SPDAT score, I can't remember all of the other information right off the top of my head, but Built for Zero will be able to tell you.
We have
all
forms
the
now.
indicators all the indicators they're looking for, we're asking.
That sounded like a cop out, and you busted him, Cameron. So, yeah, like if you want more details on that, I mean, I'm sure that Michael would be fine with you sending him an email, and he could give you a much more specific outline of those things.
I'm happy to share our intake form with anyone interested, for sure.
Yeah. So actually, maybe since that was a question, and this kind of goes along with something I was going to come back to in regards to Marie's question, is I wonder if you could actually fire us off a copy of your intake form, as well as if you have some kind of already documented outline of that barrier buster event, and then we could post that along with the slides and the recording of this webinar, and then people could download those from there.
Sure.
Okay, awesome, thank you. Now it looks like another question. What does it mean, and how do you select and use your circle of champions? And this is again Marie, I believe. So Marie, are you able to speak to this a little bit more at this point? She's on mute. Please ask for me. so I did. I don't know if that question makes sense to you, but I think she's referring to the Circle of Champions. What does it mean, and how do you select and use it?
So I think the Circle of Champions really came about quite organically. When we created our BNL pilot, we didn't choose the people around the table with an ulterior motive of them then championing the effort. It was kind of a happy coincidence. We did choose the organizations. I mean, we had the shelters and then an outreach program. So from kind of a very pragmatic standpoint, we wanted to cover our bases in terms of people who were accessing an emergency shelter or sleeping rough. But we also had very good working relationships, very close working relationships with those representatives. And so I think the Circle of Champions came about certainly during the pilot project, but I would say more so afterwards, when we realized that, you know, because of their experience with the pilot, these agencies had bought into coordinated access in such a meaningful way that they were willing to go out and champion the concept and the system on their own without prompting from us. So it certainly wasn't on our checklist of things to do when we were doing the BNL pilot project. We weren't looking to develop something like that. It was something that we realized was happening in the midst of the effort, and it was really kind of a happy accident, I guess you could say.
Okay. Okay, awesome. So Marie, I don't know if you're there, and if you want to unmute yourself, if you have a follow-up question to that or not. If you do, feel free, just unmute and start talking.
Hey, yeah, Wally, just to say, I think it's interesting. I think what's most interesting is that you named it, like the Circle of Champions. Like, people were doing it, but I feel like you put a frame around it by naming it. And then I was just sort of curious how you were continuing to kind of leverage that group, or did you meet with them specially, or is it just sort of the name you've given your governance group?
Yeah, it's not even a formal thing. I think it's just kind of, we ended up, this is what ended up happening, and that's the fact that they were out in the community championing the effort. It's kind of more of a nickname than anything. They don't have voting authority or anything like that. Just kidding. They all do.
Yeah. Yeah, no, maybe it will catch on. Maybe it will become a viral movement across Canada's homelessness serving system.
I hope so.
Champions, yeah. We'll definitely have to tweet it and post it and whatever else we do on social media. Okay, I don't see any additional questions, and we've kind of reached our hour mark. There is one question that I'm going to answer as we close off. If you could just unshare quickly. Thank you. And then I am going to share. Where did it go? There we go. Okay. Just wanted to let people know that we have coming up we have more webinars. If you go to our website, you'll see where they all are and you can register for them. But these are the next two BNLCA webinars that are coming up. One is right away on Monday. It's about prioritization, and then Tuesday, February 4th, is matching referral. Both of those, Ian DeYoung will be providing those presentations, and they will happen at 1 p.m. Eastern time. So just in regards to the last question, it was when is this recording going to be available? There might be some people who only caught part of it or want to refer back to it, and you can review them and watch them multiple times if you choose. This recording will be available either by the end of the day today or probably before noontime tomorrow. Our wonderful Debbie, part of CAH, is very good at getting these things uploaded quickly and edited and so forth. So if it's not by the end of the day today, it'll be probably in the morning tomorrow when it will be ready and available. The slides, the PDF version of the slides, will also be available at that same time. The other forms that Michael is going to send to us might be tomorrow or whenever. I'm not sure how quickly he'll be able to get them to us, but we'll put them on there as soon as we receive them. And otherwise, I think that's about all we have. Ashley, Michael, do you have any final comments before we shut down for the day?
I think I'm good. Thanks everyone for joining, and thanks again, Michael. This was a great presentation, and look forward to hearing the updates of how you've scaled further. Yeah, no, and I'm all good on this end. Thanks so much for having me. It was a great conversation, I think.
I do too. Appreciate it, Michael. Appreciate you stepping in and giving us lots of things to think about. So otherwise, folks, take care and have a great day, and we'll catch you in other webinars and community of practice calls. But until then, be safe out there and be careful out there. Take care, everybody.
Thanks.